Okay, today what I'd like to do is to prepare you a little bit for the writing of the first paper on No Name Woman and White Tigers. The first class that we're going to have today, I'd like to talk about thesis statements and topic sentences. Something that I'm sure you've talked about before, but we're going to do it again and have a little review. The next class that we'll have before you write the paper will be on MLA documentation. Today, again, as I mentioned, just thesis statements and topic sentences. On the board in front of you, you have some information on thesis statements. The basic idea of a thesis statement is to state the main point that you want to make in the paper and to state the main reason why you believe that point to be true. Now, I would recommend that the thesis statement be placed as the last sentence of the introductory paragraph. That is the last sentence of the first paragraph. Before you start the paper, you should decide what your thesis will be after you've, of course, read the material, thought about it, and perhaps done some research. Now, let's consider topic 1. Remember, for the first paper, you have two possibilities. So let's consider the first topic. Your thesis might be that the myth of Fa Mulan inspires Chinese girls to do great things. Or, on the other hand, it might be that the myth of Fa Mulan is a fantasy that exists in ironic contrast to the disappointing everyday lives of Chinese girls. Okay, so some of you may think that it's a good myth that inspires Chinese girls, or you might have the exact opposite point of view, that it's just a fantasy that exists in total irony to the very humdrum and disappointing lives of Chinese girls. And indeed, a thesis statement should be something that we could argue about. It's supposed to be an opinion. The fact is that you say what you think about the myth and why you think that in your thesis statement. For example, either you think that it is inspiring and you say why, or you think that it is just a fantasy and you say why. That's what a thesis statement is. You give your opinion and the main reason why you think that. Now, the same technique could be used for the second option. If you find a newspaper article or newspaper articles that indicate that China is all modern today, then you should say something like, modern China is nothing like the superstitious, mythical China of the past. Or, on the other hand, if you find articles that indicate that China today, like the article that I included on the assignment, still shows elements of the old China, and then you should say something like, China today, despite its modernity, still shows evidence of the old prejudices of its past. And then obviously throughout the paper, you'll have to prove either one or the other. So that brings us to the body of the paper itself. The body of the paper should have at least 2, 3, or 4 body paragraphs. So you have an introduction, and then you have 2, 3, or 4 body paragraphs, and then a conclusion. So I've suggested that after you've chosen the thesis, you should pick approximately 3 topics to back it up. If you have 3 topics, then you'll have 3 body paragraphs. You could have 2, you could have 4. So for example, let's take the first one that we chose, that the myth of Fa Mulan inspires Chinese girls to do great things. If that's your thesis statement, then you're going to have 3 examples of ways in which it inspires Chinese girls. Now, one thing you have to be very, very careful about. You're going to be graded on your content. That's if you have a good idea and good examples. but you're also going to be graded on your organization. Now, your organization means that each paragraph has one and only one main idea. And that means that I can clearly distinguish between each paragraph what the main idea of that individual paragraph is. What that means is that you shouldn't talk about the same thing in every single paragraph. So you should pick 3 ways that the girls get inspired, and each body paragraph should have one and only one clear main idea, and don't talk about the same thing over and over again in every paragraph. So for example, you might talk about number 1, the myth of Famulan. Oh, sorry, I say Famulin here, it should be Famulan, shows girls that they can be chosen from all the other girls to do great things, even if most girls don't get treated well. So remember that in the beginning of White Tigers, one girl gets picked, right? She gets chosen. The second paragraph might be, the myth of Famulan indicates that the culture values girls who help other people. Because remember, the whole point of her being chosen is that she's going to help her people. And number 3, the myth of Famulan. In the myth of Famulan, it is clear that Chinese people have to fight for equality, and that is actually true. And so girls might, really be inspired by the myth because they see that they really have to fight for their rights, and that's very clear at the end of this story. And remember, the girl in Famulan is a swordswoman, and so that might be something else that you could talk about. In each paragraph, you could talk about something specific in the myth, and each one would have its own main idea. Now, this is something that you could do for every single one of the examples that we did. If you're going to say that it's a fantasy, then you would have to take out 3 things from the myth that clearly aren't options for the girls in their real lives, right? They're not going to be whisked off to the heavens. They're not going to be able to do the great things that are actually in the myth. And the same thing you would have to do if you took the second option. If you're going to say that China is modern in contrast to the past, then you'd have to take 3 things from the newspaper article that were modern and compare them to old-fashioned things that you read about in the story. Maybe the attitude towards women, maybe the mythological aspects of believing in superstition, but you'd have to pick 3 things. Again, if you want to show that it's still old-fashioned, you'd have to pick, let's say, 3 things you found in the article that showed maybe they still believe in curses, maybe they still have old-fashioned ideas towards women, so maybe you would have 2 things, or maybe you would have 3 things. But you'd have to have 2 or 3 clear things and separate things in each paragraph, and then the conclusion can just be 2 or 3 sentences, what message you want to leave your reader with. I'm going to put a rubric on the Getting Started page so that you will see exactly how I grade, but you will be graded on content, organization, grammar, sources, that you have the right number and that they're academic sources, and documentation. I will post a 3rd Tegrity lesson on MLA documentation in the next few days, and I will send you an email when it's ready.